But I think we're in a really precarious moment in terms of race relations, because part of what Obama, and everybody felt the euphoria. I covered the election. Everybody, I know a lot of people were very, very supportive. And so people really, what's interesting about the way in which the media eventually framed that election, because remember, starting in 07, it was more like, is he black enough? Could this really happen? Then in 08, they turned it into sort of this gender war in terms of Barack versus Hillary, sort of the black man versus the white woman. So it was more of a 60s thing. Some of the commentary was almost, commentating was almost like, you were back reading Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice with, black man versus white woman, and what all this psychosexual drama was going on for a second there. And then they framed it as, it seemed like Obama was a phenomenon. He's got the nomination, and it's historic. And then it was like, but is it going to be the Bradley effect? White people are lying. They're going to say they're going to vote for him, and then he's going to lose. And then by the time he wins, they're saying, you know what? This is how we're going to frame it. America has finally dealt with racism, okay? So they framed it as we engaged nationally. Globally, people exhaled and said, wow, the Americans didn't muck this up, and we're so excited about it. But nationally, we engage in a kind of really specific narcissism and self-congratulation, saying that, you know what, this proves this is the greatest country in the world. It also proves American exceptionalism, because he couldn't have won in England, which is true. He couldn't have won in Ireland. They're saying, hell, there's certain places in Africa he couldn't have won because he was the wrong ethnic group. Because we call the black folks tribes and the white folks ethnic groups. I call everybody ethnic groups, right? So the Serbs and the Bosnians, we can say that's ethnic groups. But once you get to the black folks, you're calling them tribes, or the Native Americans, right? They're all ethnic groups. I want everyone to kind of get that. They're ethnic groups. And even the languages, we're saying it's Haitian Creole. I've got friends who are linguists at good places, and it's just Haitian. Just like English is just English, because these are Romance languages, right? So if that's the case, we're going to say we're all derived from Latin, and we're going to call it, Latin English and Latin French and all this different stuff. So these are real languages, and these are real ethnic groups, real people. But between November 4th, 2008, the election day, or November 3rd, to January 20th, 2009, we had like our post-racial America, okay? And so people can remember that interregnum is when everybody was walking and floating on air in the United States. People were polling people, and black people were saying, oh, sure, everything's great in the polls, right? Even with high unemployment, everybody's like, I really finally feel like an American. We had all these great scenes from Grant Park. And people spontaneously got together. They were singing the national anthem. So there was a real, very specific patriotic moment, right? But starting January 20th, we're back in the United States of America again, 2009. So we can tell our grandkids that, yeah, we did have a post-racial America, and it lasted from Election Day to Inauguration Day. And boy, were those great times. You know what I mean? If I could bring everybody, you could go all across the country, the Deep South, the West Coast, blacks and whites were getting together. A racial bon ami was there, right? But it was temporary. It was temporary. And now what we're left with is, on one level, when we think about race, the very fact that we have a black president really impacts and has constrained our dialogue. It hasn't expanded it, it's constrained it, because for the first time in American history, we actually have somebody who's president who's also perceived in large swaths of the country as a black leader, right? So remember, you had Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. They didn't have the same spot. You had Martin King and John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. King wasn't president, right? And a lot of times the person who's been sort of a de facto leader within black America has had some of the biggest economic criticisms and foreign policy criticisms of the nation and of notions of American exceptionalism. So we're sort of left stranded in a lot of ways where even though when we think about race and social economic indicators and mass incarceration and AIDS and HIV and healthcare and access to education, it's really desultory numbers, right? With some exceptions being at schools like Mount Holyoke and Tufts and Harvard. And the employment situation, black unemployment double and triple and at times quadruple, 5, 6 times the rate. So we see race still matters. There's still institutional racism. But the sad part that we face is that we actually have less of a national language and dialogue about this than 40 years ago. That's the whole thing, than 40 years ago. So it's not been a linear racial progression. We still have a national dialogue, but it's in fits and starts. It's only if Skip Gates gets arrested, if Oscar Grant gets shot. But we talk more about Skip Gates than Oscar Grant getting shot in Oakland. Right? So there's a real problem with that. Obviously, there's a huge major problem with that. We don't talk about black women. There's a new study. Black women, their net worth, the study was saying, was $5. They were saying it was $5, right? Where they didn't own homes. They're heading disproportionate numbers, 48% single of poor families in the country, living below a poverty line that's $20,000 for a family of 4. That people should be ashamed that that's the poverty line. Because, of course, if you're making $22,000 with a family of 4, that's poverty in the United States. So we're not talking about any of this. And again, I don't blame Barack Obama because his job as president isn't necessarily to be racial healer-in-chief or the biggest articulator of what's wrong in terms of racism because he's got a national perspective, right? But at the same token, when we think about black leadership, and there is both unelected black leadership, there's grassroots leadership like Dr. Lafayette. We've had a problem breaking through in the age of Obama with a constructive critique of race relations in America. There's a real problem. And again, even when we talk about King, and we just celebrated the holiday, one of the worst things that we do with King is flatten Dr. King's image. And we don't, Dr. King, and I was saying this in the seminar, Dr. King, no less than Malcolm X, is an American revolutionary, an African-American revolutionary, a global American revolutionary. When King is saying that, what's interesting is during the 2008 election, Obama talked about the fierce urgency of now, but he didn't finish the quote. King, in talking about the fierce urgency of now, and where do we go from here, he's talking about militarism. He's talking about racism. He's talking about materialism. He's saying these are the triplets that are threatening humanity. King is the most robustly combative individuals, not on a personal level, very nice guy, combative in terms of politics, in terms of social justice, in terms of human rights. When King is in the last few years of his life, they're comparing him to Stokely Carmichael. Newspapers are calling them Batman and Robin. That's what they're saying. They're caricaturizing King. King is a Nobel laureate who they're saying is too stupid to talk about the Vietnam War, right? We memorialize King posthumously, right? And then we freeze frame King in 1963. And we say it's a march on Washington, but we don't say it's a march on Washington for jobs and justice. The biggest person who was holding America accountable morally, right? The only reason John Kennedy goes on television in June of 1963 and talks about a revolution that's breaking out that can be a violent revolution or it can be peaceful, it's because of what Dr. King has done, right? So King actually can push presidents into doing things they don't want to do. JFK didn't want the March on Washington, okay? He wants them to stop that because Dr. Lafayette was saying, they said you bring all those Negroes into Washington, they're going to tear the whole place up. White people ran out of Washington, D.C. that day. Stores and liquor stores closed down that day. Bayard Rustin was running around trying to get porta potties and cheese sandwiches, right, to make everything okay. And guess what? There's no arrests. There's no violence because you know what? Black people are not animals. That might be news to some people in '63, and even now it's news to people. But black people are not animals, right? And they have discipline and they have cohesiveness, right? So when we think about race relations, if we could even think about Dr. King, especially when King is talking in '65, '66 in Chicago, when he's doing his Poor People's March, when he's doing his anti-war demonstrations, and also he's with the gangs in Chicago. He's making sure that and Stokely does the same thing. These folks, and Dr. Lafayette does it now, we're making sure that the violence that gangs were engaged in could be redirected and harnessed for something that made the gang members, and these were, you had gang members part of the Invaders, you had the Blackstone Rangers in Chicago, all these different peoples, and there were gangs in Memphis too, right? They made sure that those folks understood, you know what? The real problem was one about social, political, racial inequality. And they actually convinced some people. So if we could, in terms of American race relations, remember King's critique of the country, we'd be in much better shape, right? If we could remember that Dr. King actually tries to hold America accountable, but he does it using a language that's very robust and combative, but he does it out of a love for the country. Right? So he's not saying he hates America, right? And sometimes I have a back and forth with my radical friends who say, okay, when we talk about Black Power, did the Black Power activists hate or love America? I'm saying, look, when you want to transform the country you're in, you're doing that out of a spirit of proactive love. Now remember, you might love your mother, love your father, but there's times we've all had arguments where we're saying, hey, I hate you. You know, I can't stand what you're doing. And certainly when Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, you never said that.
No.
When Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael are saying things that are very combative against American presidents, it's really in the same vein. So when it comes to race relations, we have a lot that we can learn from Dr. King, and including our president, but we have to remember who Dr. King was. And this is the biggest, most articulate critic of American society and American democracy. And he wrapped up poverty, racial inequality, and war. He wrapped them all up. When people were saying these are separate issues, King said these are the main issues, and we see it now. Afghanistan, Iraq is connected to unemployment. It's connected to the reason why movies like Waiting for Superman and our kids have lotteries to try to get in to charter schools that they're hopeful are going to save their lives. And we've got hedge fund people investing in charter schools so they can get billions of dollars and race to the top money. We've got mass incarceration. We only had 98,000 black people in jail in 1954. It goes to almost 300,000 in 1984. It's over 950,000 today. So this is all connected.